Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Hercule Poirot to an estate where moonlight doesn't just fall, it listens. Beneath the glass dome of a grand aviary, filled with the soft rustle of sleeping birds, a body lies among scattered feathers and shattered glass. The only witness, a parrot repeating a phrase no one remembers teaching it. As Poirot untangles the echoes of that single line, he realizes the truth is hidden not in what was said, but in what was mimicked. Stay with me till the end, because tonight's affair isn't about what the birds saw, but what they repeated. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second, until the very end. Chapter 1. The inciting incident. There was crisp that evening. In the quaint estate of the Marston family, perched on the edge of the English countryside, the moon hung heavy and full above the sprawling grounds, casting silver rays across the neatly manicured lawns and the ivy-clad walls of the family's centuries-old manor. Tonight, however, the beauty of the moonlit landscape was at odds with the atmosphere inside the grand estate. A private gathering had been arranged, an exclusive affair for the social elite, under the guise of a celebration of the Marstons' latest acquisition, an aviary of rare, exotic birds, feathered creatures that seemed to have been plucked from the farthest corners of the globe. The moon's glow illuminated the birds' iridescent plumage through the glass of their airy, indoor sanctuary, which had become the evening's highlight. Guests, dressed in their finest attire, lingered near the aviary, marveling at the exotic species. But something darker was unfolding among the gathering. A hush began to spread, unnoticed at first, before murmurs took over. The excitement over the birds dwindled, and a chill began to ripple through the guests. At the center of the drama was the estate's mistress, Lady Caroline Marston, a sharp, elegant woman known for her poised demeanor. Her face had lost all color, her eyes wide with terror. She stood at the entrance to the aviary, frozen in place, her hand trembling as it pointed inside. At first, no one moved until one brave soul ventured in. The room was bathed in the soft, eerie light of the moon, but the birds were eerily silent, their usual rustling and chirping absent. The source of Lady Caroline's distress soon became clear. A body lay motionless in the center of the aviary, none other than Lord Christopher Marston, the family patriarch. His body was sprawled across the polished wood floor, his face frozen in an expression of absolute horror. A rare bird, its bright yellow feathers catching the light, was perched atop his chest. A dark pool of blood spread beneath him, staining the pristine wood beneath. The evening had taken an unexpected turn. The guests gasped and recoiled, some fainting, others unable to speak. Whispers grew louder, echoing through the high-ceilinged room. The hostess, pale and visibly shaken, staggered backward, gripping the frame of the door. "He's dead," she whispered. "He's dead, and he's been murdered." Lady Caroline's voice broke the fragile silence, her words sharp as though she were still in disbelief. "My husband, my dear husband, he was fine just moments ago. How can this be?" Someone hurried to fetch the police, but the estate was miles from the nearest town, and the night was growing colder by the minute. The guests, gripped by fear and confusion, seemed unable to move, uncertain whether to leave the scene or stay and witness the unfolding mystery. It was then that a voice, calm and composed, cut through the growing panic. "Ah, mon ami, what a tragedy!" The voice belonged to none other than Hercule Poirot, the renowned Belgian detective, who had been among the invited guests. His appearance was understated, as always, with his immaculate suit and neatly waxed mustache. Yet, his presence was commanding. His piercing eyes scanned the scene. Taking in every detail, Poirot approached the body without hesitation. Stepping over the ornate carpet, that had been laid out for the evening's guests. His eyes flicked over Lord Marston's lifeless form with a calmness that belied the severity of the situation. He crouched beside the body, his hands clasped behind his back as he inspected the blood-stained floor with acute precision. He turned toward Lady Caroline, his expression unreadable. "Madam, forgive me for asking, but might I inquire as to whether your husband was suffering from any condition that might explain this sudden demise?" Lady Caroline's eyes darted around the room, her lips trembling. No, he was in perfect health. We were just enjoying the evening." "This is unthinkable." Poirot gave a slight nod, his attention now shifting to the peculiar positioning of the body, the way the blood had pooled around it, and the strange arrangement of the birds. "And these creatures," he mused aloud, more to himself than to anyone in particular. "They are rather silent tonight. A most curious thing indeed." Lady Caroline stiffened. "The birds? Why, yes, they were chirping a moment ago, before we came in. But they are quiet now." Her gaze flickered toward the glass aviary, then back to Poirot. "You think it's connected?" Poirot's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Indeed, madam, there is something most intricate about the scene. The dead man, the blood, the silence of the birds. It is too contrived to deliberate to be mere coincidence." At that moment, a police constable arrived, flanked by 2 officers, and Poirot's sharp gaze flicked to them. "Gentlemen," he greeted them with a formal bow, "I am Hercule Poirot, and it seems that the evening's festivities have taken a most tragic turn. I suggest we proceed with caution. This is no simple accident, I assure you," with a final glance at the body. Poirot straightened and looked over at Lady Caroline. "Madam, I would suggest we hold off on calling the authorities just yet. There are many pieces to this puzzle, and I am quite certain the answers lie somewhere within this very room." The hostess looked at him, her expression both fearful and hopeful. "You believe it was murder, then?" Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. "Ah, mon ami, of that I have no doubt. But it is not just any murder. It is an affair, a mystery that must be unraveled by the sharpest of minds. And fortunately for you, you have invited one who is quite skilled at such matters." With that, the stage was set. The guests, still stunned, had no idea that they were caught in a game of psychological deception, their every move being scrutinized by the one man who could see through their lies and secrets. Hercule Poirot. The game, as Poirot knew well, had only just begun. Chapter 2. The first close scene inside the aviary was more unsettling. The longer one looked at it, Hercule Poirot remained crouched beside the body of Lord Christopher Marston, his gaze sharp and unwavering. His eyes flicked briefly to the other guests, who stood in varying states of shock, some with their hands clasped together, some with their arms crossed, as if to shield themselves from the horror in the room. None of them moved. There was a strange, almost reverent silence hanging in the air, punctuated only by the occasional sound of someone shuffling nervously. Poirot's mind was already racing. His little gray cells were working overtime, assembling the puzzle pieces in his mind. The blood had pooled beneath Lord Marston in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be random. It hadn't simply spilled. It had spread in a way that hinted at a controlled act, not a frenzied one. There was no sign of struggle, no broken furniture, no signs of a violent confrontation. Yet Lord Marston lay there, his eyes wide with terror. The birds, normally loud and vibrant, had gone eerily silent. Their feathers shimmered faintly in the moonlight, but their stillness was just as unnerving as the body on the floor. Poirot's gaze lingered on them. They were an essential part of the puzzle. He could feel it, but how? Standing, he turned to Lady Caroline, who was still frozen in place, her hand gripping the doorframe as if she feared she might collapse at any moment. She had been the one to discover the body, and though she appeared outwardly composed, the dread in her eyes spoke volumes. "Madam," Poirot began, his voice soft but firm. "Please tell me, when did you last see your husband alive?" Lady Caroline blinked, her mind clearly struggling to keep up with the events unfolding around her. I saw him earlier this evening, in the drawing room," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "He was fine. He was so very animated about the birds. We had just been discussing the aviary and the rare species we had acquired." Poirot nodded, his lips pressed together in thought. "And you say he was alive when you left him?" Yes, absolutely," she affirmed. "I don't understand. There was no sign of trouble, nothing unusual. It doesn't make sense." Poirot's gaze drifted back to Lord Marston's body. "Indeed, it does not. But this," he gestured to the stillness in the room, "this is no ordinary crime. What has been left behind are clues, traces of a story still incomplete, and it is only by piecing together the small, seemingly insignificant details that we shall uncover the truth." As he spoke, Poirot's eyes fell on the floor near Lord Marston's hand. Something about the position of his fingers caught his attention. The fingers were slightly curled, almost as if he had been in the process of reaching for something before death had overtaken him. Poirot crouched again, his fingers delicately brushing the blood-stained carpet near the hand. There, glinting slightly in the dim light, was an object, a small, silver cufflink. It had been dislodged from Lord Marston's shirt sleeve and lay just out of reach, as though it had been dropped in the final moments before the victim's life was snuffed out. Poirot picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hand. "A cufflink," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "It could be a clue, but what does it mean?" Lady Caroline looked over, her brow furrowing. "A cufflink, but it's just one. His cufflinks were always a set." "Yes, and this one appears to have fallen here, just by the hand. It is an odd detail," Poirot continued, his mind running through the possibilities. "A sign of struggle, or perhaps an indication of something more. A man like Lord Marston, concerned with his appearance, would not willingly part with a cufflink unless something had forced his hand." Poirot stood again, his attention drawn to the rest of the scene. His eyes scanned the room carefully, every corner, every inch of the floor. He noticed that, despite the blood spilt on the floor, the rest of the room seemed remarkably clean. There were no other signs of violence or disorder, nothing to indicate that a scuffle had taken place. "But where is the weapon?" Poirot asked aloud, as if the question itself might reveal the answer. His eyes met Lady Caroline's again, his voice taking on a quiet intensity. "A man is dead, but no weapon has been found. The blood here is a telltale sign, a clue to the nature of the crime." Lady Caroline's hands wrung together as she spoke. There was no weapon, Poirot. I don't understand. How could someone have killed him without leaving a trace? There are no marks on his body, no signs of. No marks at all. He's just—" Poirot held up his hand, his eyes narrowing. "Ah, that is what is most curious. This murder has been performed with precision, no rash blows, no hasty actions. It is a calculated act, and whoever is behind it knows exactly what they are doing. The weapon, perhaps, is something untraceable." His mind raced, connecting the dots. The eerie silence of the birds, the precise placement of Lord Marston's body, the lone cufflink, and the clean nature of the scene, all of these things spoke to a murder that had been carefully orchestrated. It was no random act of violence, but a deliberate execution. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound from behind him. He turned to find one of the guests, a young man named Charles Wainwright, standing in the doorway. His face pale. "I've just spoken to the servants," Wainwright said, his voice shaking. "They saw nothing unusual, but one of them mentioned hearing a noise just before Lady Caroline found the body. It was faint, but it sounded like something heavy falling. They didn't think much of it." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "A noise, a fall?" He stood up straight, turning toward the man. "Do you know what it was, monsieur? Or where did it came from?" Wainwright shook his head. "No, it was just a brief noise. Nothing else. The servants are nervous, and, well, they were all busy with their duties. I don't think they could have seen anything more." Poirot nodded slowly, his thoughts whirring. "The key lies in these details, monsieur. The details that seem insignificant at first, but, when woven together, will reveal the truth. We must be patient." The tension in the room was palpable. The guests were still reeling from the shock, but Poirot had already begun his silent investigation, taking mental notes of every person in the room, every nuance of behavior, and every clue left behind. The first clues had been uncovered, but the full story, Poirot knew, would take much more to unfold. Chapter 3. The gathering of suspects there in the room seemed thick with uncertainty. As Hercule Poirot moved to the center of the room, his eyes scanning each guest, his mind already working to unravel the tangled web of motives, lies, and deception that surrounded him. The guests, still shaken by the shocking death of Lord Christopher Marston, now found themselves trapped in an unspoken web of suspicion. They had been ushered into the drawing room, a large and opulent space with deep red velvet curtains and gilded furniture. Their faces still pale and anxious, Poirot, with his usual grace, motioned for them to take seats as he stood near the fireplace, observing them all closely. Lady Caroline was seated in an armchair by the window, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the fabric of her dress. She appeared exhausted, as if the weight of the night was too much for her to bear. Beside her, her younger sister, Marguerite, sat rigidly, her eyes darting nervously between Poirot and the others in the room. Charles Wainwright, the young man who had spoken earlier, leaned against the doorframe, still looking pale but now with a faint, anxious air about him. His gaze shifted quickly from Poirot to the others, as if unsure where to place his focus. Poirot let his eyes linger on each of them for a moment longer before speaking, his voice calm but firm. "I trust you all understand that the tragedy which has befallen Lord Marston is no ordinary incident. It is a murder, and I will need to investigate thoroughly. For that, I require your full cooperation." There was a pause as the guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions ranging from disbelief to fear. It was Lady Caroline who spoke first, her voice soft but sharp with emotion. I don't understand, Monsieur Poirot. Why are you speaking as if it was a murder? Could it not have been an accident, a fall? There are so many possibilities." Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Madam, I understand your shock, but as I said before, this is no accident. There is too much that does not fit. The position of the body, the absence of struggle, the precise nature of the blood. All these details point to a crime planned with great care." Lady Caroline's face turned even paler, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Marguerite, her younger sister, spoke up, her voice tinged with anxiety. "But we have no idea who could have done such a thing. It doesn't make sense. We were all here, together, enjoying the evening. None of us." Poirot raised a hand gently, cutting her off. "Madam, I do not yet know who among you is responsible, but I will find out. It is crucial that I understand the relationships between each of you, the motives that may lie beneath the surface." His eyes shifted to the others in the room, each person now under his scrutiny. "I shall begin by speaking with each of you individually, and I must ask that you refrain from speaking to one another about the events that have occurred. Trust no one but me, for I shall uncover the truth through your words and your silences." Poirot paused, allowing his words to settle over the group. He could feel the tension building, the quiet fear in the room growing palpable. They were not only fearful of the situation, but of one another as well. The subtle undercurrent of suspicion had already begun to take root. "Let us begin," Poirot said. his voice smooth but resolute. "Monsieur Wainwright, I will speak with you first." Charles Wainwright, still visibly shaken, pushed himself off the doorframe and walked to the center of the room, his eyes darting nervously as he sat down on one of the velvet armchairs. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair and let out a sigh. His usual composure had all but vanished, replaced with an air of unease that did not escape Poirot's notice. "Now, Monsieur Wainwright," Poirot began, folding his hands behind his back as he studied the young man. "You were the first to discover the servant's account of hearing a noise before the body was found. A faint sound, you said. Could you tell me more of this? Were there any details you noticed? Any sign of something out of place?" Wainwright shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I didn't hear the noise myself, Monsieur Poirot. I was speaking with Lord Marston earlier, but when I left the room, I didn't hear anything strange." He paused, wringing his hands together. "The servants were the ones who mentioned the noise, but I didn't think it was important at the time. It just didn't seem like something to worry about." Poirot's gaze hardened, his expression impassive. "Ah, but Monsieur Wainwright, it is exactly that kind of small detail that can often prove to be the most important. The faint noise, could it have been a sound of struggle? Or something else entirely?" Wainwright glanced up, his expression blank. "I suppose it's possible, but I can't be sure. The servants don't know much more, and honestly, I don't either. I didn't think much of it until you mentioned it." Poirot nodded slowly, then moved on. "And where were you, monsieur, when Lady Caroline found the body? What were you doing at the time?" Wainwright hesitated, his gaze flicking to the others in the room. "I was in the study, alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was reading. I didn't think it was important." Poirot's piercing eyes studied him for a moment longer before he nodded curtly. "Thank you, monsieur. You may return to your place," as Wainwright returned to his position by the door. Poirot's gaze moved to the next person in the room. His eyes lingered on Lady Caroline and her sister, both of whom were now visibly on edge. The clock on the wall ticked softly in the background, as if echoing the silence that stretched between them. Poirot turned to Marguerite next. "Madam, I would now speak with you." Marguerite straightened, her eyes wide. "Of course," she said quickly, her voice betraying a touch of nervousness. She glanced briefly at her sister before sitting up straighter, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Tell me, madam," Poirot said softly, "what is your relationship with your sister, Lady Caroline? You seem close, yet there is an unease in the air between you. I would ask if you have any concerns regarding Lord Marston's recent behavior, or perhaps your sister's." Marguerite stiffened, and for a moment, a shadow of something fear perhaps crossed her face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "My sister and I, we are close," she said, her voice steady but strained. "But there have been some tensions recently. I cannot deny that." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "But no, there is nothing unusual about Lord Marston's behavior that I noticed. Everything seemed fine until this tragedy." Poirot watched her closely, noting the subtle shifts in her posture and the way her eyes darted nervously from one person to another. "Ah, yes, but it is often the smallest of details that reveal the greatest truths." The tension in the room was palpable as Poirot moved on, his mind already working, assembling the first pieces of the puzzle. But the game was only just beginning, and the web of lies and deception would take more time to untangle. Chapter 4. Poirot Arrivas' evening had already taken a dark turn, and the tension in the drawing room of the Marston estate was palpable. The guests, still in shock, were gathered together as Poirot continued to piece together the fractured narrative of the night. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked relentlessly, its sound almost deafening in the heavy silence that had fallen over the room. Poirot stood by the fireplace, his hands folded behind his back, his gaze sharp and calculating. Lady Caroline sat near the window, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were still red from tears, but now there was something colder in her expression of fear that had yet to fully release its grip on her. Beside her, Marguerite, her younger sister, shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twitching as they restlessly toyed with her gloves. The remaining guests stood awkwardly, their faces uncertain, trying to avoid making eye contact with one another. Poirot knew this was the moment to press forward. He could feel the rising suspicion that had begun to take root in the room, and he knew it was time to unveil the truth hidden in the shadows. Slowly, he stepped away from the fireplace and turned to face the group. His voice, soft but firm, sliced through the tension. "I must insist that we proceed with caution," Poirot said, his eyes moving from one guest to the next. "The man who lies dead in the aviary was not just a victim of random chance. His death is no accident. We are faced with a murder deliberate and precise." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Lady Caroline, still holding herself together, stood up from her chair and spoke in a voice that trembled but tried to remain composed. "Monsieur Poirot, you believe it was murder, but how can you be certain? Could it not have been an accident?" Poirot's expression softened slightly, but his gaze remained steady. "Madam, accidents do not leave behind the peculiarities that we see here. No, this was a carefully planned act. A murderer does not act in haste. They plan, they observe, they wait for the right moment." Lady Caroline's lips trembled, but she remained silent, her eyes avoiding his. Poirot glanced briefly at the other guests before turning his attention to Charles Wainwright, who had been standing quietly near the door. "Ah, Monsieur Wainwright," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the silence. "You were the first to mention hearing a noise before Lady Caroline found the body. I would like to know more. What did the servants hear? And why did you not mention it sooner?" Wainwright shifted uncomfortably, clearly nervous under Poirot's piercing gaze. "I wasn't sure it was relevant," he stammered, glancing around. "The servants were nervous, and it was faint, just a noise. They didn't make much of it, but when I heard them talking about it, I thought it was worth mentioning." "And what did they say about it?" Poirot pressed. "They mentioned it sounded like something heavy falling, but no one saw anything. They thought it was just a door creaking or something. I didn't think it was important at the time." Poirot absorbed this carefully, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. A faint noise, perhaps a door, perhaps something heavier. A small detail, but Poirot knew that in mysteries such as this, no detail was truly insignificant. "I see," Poirot murmured, stepping back and scanning the room. "And what of the rest of you? Did any of you hear this noise?" The others shook their heads, some more vehemently than others. There was a hesitation in the air, a subtle, collective avoidance of any mention of the sound. Poirot's gaze lingered on them for a moment longer before he moved on to his next question. "Tell me," he said, his voice once again calm but firm. "Has Lord Marston mentioned anything recently that would suggest someone might wish him harm? Any sign of danger? Any threats?" Lady Caroline's eyes darted quickly to her sister, and then to Wainwright. A moment of silence passed before she answered, her voice low but steady. "No, nothing," she replied. "He wasn't a man who shared his worries. If there had been a threat, he would not have told me. He had many business dealings, but he never spoke of them. I knew he was troubled, but I never imagined something like this." Poirot nodded, his eyes shifting to the young woman. "And you, Madame Marguerite? Did you notice anything unusual? Any change in Lord Marston's behavior?" Marguerite fidgeted nervously in her chair, her eyes avoiding Poirot's. I didn't see anything," she stammered. "Lord Marston, he seemed fine, but there were moments when he seemed lost in thought. That's all." Poirot tilted his head slightly, analyzing her with his characteristic precision. "Moments of unease, perhaps. And yet, madam, there is always more beneath the surface. I wonder if you were to reflect, might you recall any conversations, any brief exchanges with him? Perhaps a fleeting disagreement that might explain his state of mind? Marguerite's face flushed slightly, but she was quick to recover. No, nothing like that. He was a private man, and I respected that. Poirot observed her carefully, his brow furrowing slightly. There was something in her demeanor that didn't sit quite right, a flicker of discomfort, a reluctance to speak fully. Yet Poirot chose not to press further for now. He would wait for the moment when the truth would slip. Very well, Poirot said, his voice softer now. I will need to speak with each of you again. But for now, I suggest we all remain calm and avoid discussing this further. The truth is in the details, and it will reveal itself, but not yet. The room was heavy with the weight of his words. The guests, though still fearful, seemed to settle into a strange kind of unease. They knew Poirot was right. They were all inextricably tied to the mystery of Lord Marston's death, and the truth, it seemed, was slowly being uncovered, piece by piece. Poirot's mind was already moving ahead, his thoughts racing toward the next stage of the investigation. With each moment, with each new detail, the web of deception grew tighter. But Poirot was closing in, and the answer would be revealed soon. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The atmosphere in the drawing room remained heavy, the silence almost suffocating as Poirot moved among the guests, carefully observing their reactions. There was a palpable unease among them, a collective sense of dread that seemed to grow with each passing minute. Lady Caroline sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze distant, while Marguerite fidgeted nervously beside her. The other guests stood around the room, unsure of what to do, unsure of whom to trust. Poirot knew that the key to solving this mystery lay in the details. He had already begun to piece together fragments of information, but the full picture was still elusive. His mind raced as he prepared for the next stage of his investigation. It was time to begin the interviews. Turning to the group, Poirot spoke in his usual calm, measured tone. I must ask that each of you remain composed. I will be speaking with you individually to uncover the truth. The answers lie within you, though some of you may not even realize it. Lady Caroline's eyes met his, but there was no recognition in her gaze, only the blankness of shock and fear. Poirot turned to the others. I shall begin with Monsieur Wainwright. Charles Wainwright, who had been standing near the door, stepped forward, his movements stiff. He looked nervous, his eyes darting between the others as he approached Poirot. Please, Monsieur Wainwright. Poirot gestured to the chair. Sit. Wainwright lowered himself into the seat, his hands trembling as they rested on his knees. He gave Poirot an anxious look, then quickly glanced away, as if trying to avoid any further scrutiny. Now, Monsieur, Poirot began, his voice soft but insistent. I understand you were one of the first to speak with the servants about the strange noise they heard before the discovery of Lord Marston's body. Wainwright shifted uncomfortably. Yes, he replied, his voice low. The servants mentioned hearing something like a heavy object falling. I thought it was just a door or something, but when I heard them talking, I thought it might be important. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Wainwright's face. And did you hear this noise yourself, monsieur? Wainwright shook his head. No, I didn't hear it, but I didn't think it was anything unusual at the time. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Very well. And where were you when Lady Caroline found the body? I was in the study, alone, Wainwright answered quickly. I didn't leave until I heard Lady Caroline scream. I went straight to her. Interesting, Poirot murmured. You were alone, you say? And did you see anyone else in the vicinity of the aviary during that time? Wainwright hesitated, his brow furrowing in concentration. No, I didn't see anyone. I'm not sure who could have. Poirot raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Monsieur Wainwright, I do not suspect you, but I must ask you to think carefully. The slightest detail, the smallest piece of information could prove crucial." Wainwright seemed to wilt under the weight of Poirot's gaze, but he gave a small nod in response. "I understand." Poirot stood, taking a moment to absorb what Wainwright had said. There was a lack of certainty in the young man's words, an unease that suggested there was more he wasn't saying. But Poirot would return to him later, once he had more to go on. Turning to the group, Poirot continued, "Next, I shall speak with Madame Marguerite." Marguerite's eyes widened slightly, and she stood quickly, moving to the chair Poirot had indicated. Her movements were stiff, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Betraying her nervousness, "Madam," Poirot began, his tone gentle, "I must ask you to tell me everything you know about your brother-in-law's behavior. Lord Marston, what was he like in the days leading up to his death?" Marguerite hesitated, her fingers curling around the fabric of her dress. He was distant," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There were moments when he seemed so preoccupied, as if he was hiding something. I didn't know what it was. I tried to talk to him about it, but he just brushed me off. I think he was troubled." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Troubled by what, madam? Did he ever mention anything specific?" Marguerite bit her lip, avoiding his gaze. "No, he never told me, but I overheard a conversation once between him and a man. I didn't hear much of it, but I heard the man say something about paying the price. It sounded serious, but I didn't know who the man was." Poirot absorbed this information, his mind working quickly. "A man, did you see him?" Marguerite shook her head. "No, just the voice. It was low, harsh. I don't know who it was, but it sounded threatening." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "This man, do you recall anything else about him? Anything that might help us identify him?" Marguerite shook her head again. "No, nothing more. It was just a conversation I overheard. I didn't want to interfere." Poirot took a step back, his fingers tapping together as he pondered the new information. A conversation about paying the price. This was something to pursue further. And the mysterious man, whose identity was still unknown, could hold the key to the mystery. "Very well, madam," Poirot said, his voice softening. "You have been most helpful. Please, if you recall anything else, do not hesitate to inform me." Marguerite stood, her expression still tense, and retreated to the side of the room, her hands twisting nervously. Poirot turned back to the remaining guests, his mind already racing through the possibilities. The interviews had begun, and with each passing moment, Poirot felt the case drawing closer to its conclusion. But the truth, he knew, was still buried beneath layers of lies, secrets, and half-truths, and he would stop at nothing to uncover it. Chapter 6. First false-led soft murmur of conversation filled the room, but it was more a collection of anxious whispers than any real exchange. Poirot had carefully examined each guest, each response, and with every piece of information, he felt the threads of the mystery begin to weave together, though not in the way he had anticipated. There were more questions than answers, but he knew that this was the nature of such cases. Nothing would ever be revealed easily, not without careful observation and the slow, steady accumulation of facts. Poirot's eyes flicked to the door as another guest, Dr. Samuel Thornton, entered the room. Thorne was a family friend and a doctor. Though his role in the household appeared more ceremonial than essential, he had been sitting apart from the group earlier, seemingly lost in thought. The doctor's arrival was timely perhaps, Poirot thought. There was something more to his presence tonight than mere coincidence. "Ah, Monsieur Thorne," Poirot greeted him as the doctor entered, his tone warm but focused. "I would like to speak with you now." Dr. Thorne looked startled for a moment, but then quickly masked it with a neutral expression. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot," he replied, walking over to where the detective stood by the fireplace. Poirot gestured to the chair beside him. "Please sit. I must ask you about the events surrounding Lord Marston's death. As the family's physician, you must have seen him recently. Was there anything unusual in his health? Any symptoms or signs that might have suggested his life was in danger?" Dr. Thorne seemed to pause, as if carefully considering his words. "Lord Marston was in fine health," he said slowly, his voice carrying the calm assurance of a man used to making medical assessments. He did not complain of any ailments. In fact, we last spoke a few days ago about his investments and some new projects he had in the works. There was no mention of any threats or any kind of distress. Poirot observed him carefully. The doctor's calm demeanor was in stark contrast to the unease that hung in the room, like a heavy fog. "You are certain of this, Monsieur Thorne? No complaints of anxiety, no signs of stress?" Thorne nodded, though a faint flicker of hesitation passed across his face. "None that I recall. But as a physician, I only ever observed him in a professional capacity. I am not privy to all the personal matters of the family." Poirot leaned in slightly. "You say you are not privy, but surely you have had a more intimate knowledge of Lord Marston. His health, his stress, these things affect everyone, even a man of wealth and stature. Is it possible you may have missed something? A sign of mental strain, perhaps?" The doctor's gaze flicked away for just a moment, and Poirot caught it. "No, nothing of that nature," Thorne responded quickly, his voice a bit firmer now. "If there were something troubling him, I would have known. He had a lot of investments, but it's not my place to ask about such things. My job was simply to ensure he was well." Poirot did not press further, though he was not convinced by the doctor's responses. There was something guarded in his manner, an evasiveness that might have been explained by the man's professional boundaries, or perhaps by something more. Poirot let the silence stretch for a moment before he spoke again. "Monsieur Thorne, tell me, did you see anything unusual last night? Anything that might suggest someone else had been in Lord Marston's room? Or perhaps someone acting strangely before the tragedy?" Thorne shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I did not see anything unusual," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty Poirot had hoped for. "I was in my study most of the evening. I did hear some raised voices, but that's nothing new in a house such as this. There's always some kind of disagreement among the staff or the family. It's not uncommon." Poirot's sharp gaze never left the doctor's face, but the words didn't fit. The subtle hesitation, the strained tone suggested there was more to the story. Poirot didn't need to press him further just yet, but this was a lead to follow. "I see," Poirot said, leaning back. "Thank you, Monsieur Thorne. You may return to your place." The doctor stood up quickly, his movement stiff as if he were eager to leave. He offered a quick, almost curt nod before making his way back to the group. Poirot watched him go, his mind already running through the details. The doctor had been evasive. Yes, but more importantly, his responses hadn't added up. There was a crack in his story that Poirot was not yet ready to expose. But the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that the good doctor had hidden something. Turning back to the others, Poirot's eyes scanned the room. The atmosphere had grown heavier since his last interview. Everyone was on edge, unsure of what would come next. The tension between the guests had only intensified, as each person likely began to wonder who among them might be responsible for the murder. Poirot knew the key to the mystery lay within this very room. Each of them had secrets, each of them had a reason to hide something. But who was the murderer? And how could he be certain which one of these seemingly innocent people had struck down Lord Marston in cold blood? He took a deep breath, his fingers tapping the back of the chair thoughtfully. The first false lead had been uncovered. The doctor, seemingly a friend to the family, was hiding something. But what? It was time to take a step back and examine the greater picture, the web of relationships, the lies, and the fears that connected them all. Poirot had a feeling that the real answer was closer than anyone realized, and he was ready to uncover it. But he would need patience. The game was far from over. Chapter 7. The psychological Gammoth drawing room fell into an uneasy silence. After Poirot's conversation with Dr. Thorne, the guests were unsettled, some trying to mask their discomfort, others openly fidgeting in their chairs. Poirot, ever the observer, noted each of their reactions carefully. It was clear that the tension was building, and yet the truth remained elusive. Poirot had learned much from his initial conversations. Lady Caroline's protective nature toward her husband, Marguerite's reluctance to speak of what she had overheard, and Wainwright's nervousness, all of it pointed to a web of secrets carefully woven together. But Poirot knew that the key to unlocking the mystery was not simply in the facts they shared. It was in their behavior, their responses, and their unspoken truths. The detective's mind churned as he paced the room slowly, his hands folded behind his back. He needed to stir things up a little, make them uncomfortable, force the truth out through subtle pressure. His little gray cells were already formulating a plan, one that would test each of the guests and reveal cracks in their carefully constructed facades. "Madam," Poirot turned to Lady Caroline, his voice steady and calm, "I must ask you something further. You mentioned that your husband was distant in the days leading up to his death. Did he have any interactions with anyone outside of his usual circle? Did anyone unusual come to the estate?" Lady Caroline looked startled by the question. I don't know. There were no visitors, at least none that I knew of. We had a few business meetings with our solicitor, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary." Poirot's gaze sharpened as he studied her face. "You are certain of that?" Lady Caroline hesitated, her lips pressing together tightly. "Yes," she said firmly, though her eyes seemed to wander for a moment, as if she were searching for something. "I am certain." Poirot did not push further. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt or guilt, but he would not rush to conclusions just yet. Instead, he shifted his attention to Marguerite, who was sitting quietly by the window, staring out at the darkened grounds. "Madame Marguerite," Poirot's voice broke the stillness, and she turned to face him, startled. "You mentioned earlier that you overheard your brother-in-law speaking with someone, a man who seemed angry. Could you tell me more about this?" Marguerite seemed to stiffen at the question, and Poirot noted the slight flush on her cheeks. I don't know much," she stammered, her voice faltering slightly. "It was just a conversation I overheard. I didn't hear much, but I know Lord Marston was upset. The man was angry, and Lord Marston was trying to calm him down. He said something about paying the price, but that's all I remember." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing as he considered this new piece of the puzzle. "A man, you say? Did you see him? Could you describe him?" Marguerite shook her head. "No, I couldn't see him clearly. But his voice, it was rough, harsh. I don't think I'd recognize him if I saw him again." Poirot pressed his lips together, suppressing the desire to push her further. There was something about her story that didn't sit right. It felt incomplete, as if she were holding back key details. But Poirot knew that forcing the issue would only drive her deeper into her shell. He would need to tread carefully. Turning to the others, Poirot's eyes rested on Wainwright, who had been standing in the corner, seemingly lost in thought. He had not spoken much since his initial interview, and Poirot was curious about what he was thinking. "Monsieur Wainwright," Poirot began, his tone soft but probing, "you were in the study when Lady Caroline discovered the body. Tell me, did you hear anything unusual while you were there?" Wainwright's eyes darted nervously as he met Poirot's gaze. "No, nothing at all," he replied quickly. "I was just reading. There was nothing strange about the night." Poirot tilted his head slightly, studying him with intensity. "Nothing at all, monsieur? No sounds, no voices, no disturbances?" Wainwright swallowed hard, his nervousness palpable. "No," he repeated, his voice shaking ever so slightly. "I heard nothing." Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, his gaze unwavering. Wainwright shifted uncomfortably under the detective's scrutiny, and Poirot could see the telltale signs of guilt sweat on his brow, the rapid blinking of his eyes, the way he kept glancing at the door as if hoping to escape. After a moment, Poirot spoke again, his voice calm. "Monsieur Wainwright, you seem uncomfortable. Is there something you are not telling me?" The young man hesitated, his lips parting as if to speak, but then he closed his mouth again. He looked toward the door, his feet shifting as if he might bolt at any moment. Poirot's gaze was piercing, and he knew that Wainwright was on the verge of a confession, or at least a slip of the tongue. "I'm not sure," Wainwright stammered. "It's just that. I didn't hear anything, but I saw something. After Lady Caroline found the body, Before he could continue, Lady Caroline interjected, her voice sharp. "What do you mean, Monsieur Wainwright? What did you see?" Wainwright's eyes widened, and he quickly shook his head. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause any trouble. It's nothing, really." Poirot raised his hand, signaling for calm. "No, Monsieur Wainwright, it is not nothing. What did you see?" Wainwright opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it again, clearly torn. Finally, he blurted out, "I saw Dr. Thorne leaving the aviary just before Lady Caroline entered." He looked startled, as if he didn't want to be seen. Poirot's eyes flickered toward the doctor, who was standing at the edge of the room, watching the exchange with a careful mask of composure. "Dr. Thorne, you say?" Poirot murmured, his mind processing the new development. Interesting. Very interesting. The psychological game had begun. The web of lies was tightening, and now, with this new clue, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. Poirot knew that the truth was getting closer, but there were still more layers to peel back. Before the final reveal, Chapter 8, a secondary mystery drawing room remained tense, filled with the anxiety of those who had gathered there. Poirot stood silently, his mind racing, processing each piece of information gathered so far. But despite his sharp deductions, something was missing, something he couldn't quite place. He needed to provoke more reactions, gather more clues. As he turned back to the group, he noticed how the guests were avoiding one another's eyes. They were all aware of their place in the web of suspicion, each of them likely wondering who among them might be responsible for Lord Marston's death. The atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to something more sinister. Like a storm ready to break, Poirot's focus was on Dr. Thorne, who had been standing slightly apart from the others, his face as impassive as ever. The doctor had been one of the more composed members of the group, but Poirot knew that people like him often hid the deepest secrets. "Monsieur Thorne," Poirot called, his voice calm but firm. "We must speak again. I believe there are further details you have not yet revealed." Thorne stiffened, but only for a moment, before he gave a slight nod and moved toward Poirot. He was a tall man, his posture perfect, but there was a flicker of tension in his otherwise controlled demeanor. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. What more do you wish to know?" Poirot studied him closely, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Earlier, you mentioned that you checked the aviary to calm the birds, but you did not mention when you entered the room. Was there anyone else in the area at that time? Anyone who might have seen you?" Dr. Thorne hesitated, his lips pressing together tightly. "I went to check on them after dinner, when most of the guests were in the drawing room. No one was nearby when I entered." His voice was steady, but Poirot noticed his eyes flicker briefly toward the others before returning to him. Poirot's brow furrowed, his suspicion growing. "You were certain no one saw you?" he asked again, his tone deliberate. "Because, monsieur, it is odd that you would not have mentioned your presence near the scene when I first questioned you." Thorne seemed to struggle with his response. "I didn't think it was necessary. The birds were disturbed, and I simply wanted to check on them." There was no reason to think anyone would be concerned. Poirot observed him carefully. There was something in his words that didn't quite add up. He was too quick to dismiss his presence at the scene. The timing was important. He had been near the crime scene, but had not mentioned it until now. Poirot's instincts were telling him that the doctor knew more than he was letting on. Before Poirot could press further, a soft noise interrupted their exchange. A faint, high-pitched cry from the hallway outside. It was a noise that caught the attention of everyone in the room. The guests turned toward the door in confusion. It wasn't a scream or a shout, but something that carried a sense of urgency, a cry for help. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he listened, his mind already processing what could be happening. Without a word, he moved toward the door, his footsteps quick and determined. The others hesitated for a moment before following, unsure of what they had just heard. Poirot moved swiftly through the hallway, the sound of hurried footsteps growing louder as they approached. It was then that they reached the servants' quarters, and the faint noise became clearer, a woman sobbing, muffled by the door. Poirot paused for a moment, signaling for the others to remain quiet, and pushed the door open just a crack. Inside, one of the servants, Emily, was kneeling on the floor, her face buried in her hands as she cried uncontrollably. Her sobs echoed in the small room, a sound filled with desperation. At the sight, Poirot's expression softened slightly, but his mind stayed focused. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, his voice calm but firm. "What is happening? Why are you in such distress?" Emily looked up, her face pale, her eyes filled with fear. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to cause trouble," she stammered. "I found something that shouldn't have been found." Poirot knelt beside her, his gaze steady. "What did you find, mademoiselle? What has caused this distress?" Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice shaking as she spoke. "A letter," she said, her words almost inaudible. "It was in the linen closet. I didn't open it, but I saw the envelope. It was addressed to Lord Marston. It said from the unknown." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "From the unknown, you say?" He allowed the silence to linger, letting the weight of the words sink in. A letter, hidden away, addressed by someone who remained anonymous. It could very well be the clue that connected everything. But why had the servant seen it and not mentioned it before? "Where is this letter now, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked. Emily stood up shakily, her hands trembling as she walked over to a small desk in the corner. She pulled open a drawer and retrieved the envelope, handing it to Poirot with a nervous glance. He took it carefully, his mind already running through the possibilities. As he unfolded the letter, his eyes scanned the few lines written in a neat but aggressive hand. The contents were clear, if cryptic, threatening, demanding, and speaking of payment that Lord Marston had yet to make. It was a message full of menace, and the mention of paying the price was unmistakable. "Thank you, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice low but full of gratitude. "You have helped me more than you know," as Emily nodded and moved back to her position. Poirot's mind swirled with the new information. The letter was an important lead, and it pointed directly to someone who had a vested interest in Lord Marston's downfall. But who and why? The mystery was deepening, and the truth was beginning to take shape. But Poirot knew the answers wouldn't come easily. The game had changed again, more pieces, more players. But one thing was clear: the killer had left behind more than just a body. The letter was the key. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. Poirot's mind raced as he folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his pocket. The cryptic message from the unknown had sent a new wave of curiosity surging through him. He knew that letters like this were never just words on paper. They were breadcrumbs scattered on a path that led to the truth. And now, the path was beginning to look less like a series of isolated clues and more like a complex web, with each guest tied to Lord Marston's demise in some way. He stood quietly in the servants' quarters, considering the latest discovery. The rest of the group had not yet followed him into the hallway, but Poirot knew that the time to act was now. The letter had been hidden, and the act of hiding it suggested that whoever had placed it there wanted to keep it out of view, perhaps even from those closest to Lord Marston. But why? Who was the unknown writer, and what had they meant by paying the price? Poirot stepped out of the room, the letter still weighing heavily in his pocket. He needed to get back to the group. He couldn't afford to let the momentum slip. The others were waiting for him, no doubt filled with their own questions, their own speculations. He had no time to waste. The hallway outside was still eerily quiet. As Poirot moved back toward the drawing room, his thoughts turned once more to the guests in the house. Each of them had something to hide. Each of them had motives, secrets, and alliances. It was no longer just a case of a murder. It was a tangled web of relationships and concealed truths. And the more he observed, the more he understood that the key to the puzzle was in understanding these relationships. Poirot returned to the drawing room, where the group had gathered once again. The tension in the air was palpable, but he made no move to address it immediately. Instead, he took a moment to study the guests. Their eyes avoided one another, their body language tense, like a group of conspirators trying to hide their guilt. "Madam," Poirot said, turning toward Lady Caroline, "I must ask you once more, were there any financial difficulties, perhaps, that your husband was facing? I know that he had business dealings, but I wonder if there were any debts, any unresolved conflicts that he may have kept from you." Lady Caroline stiffened at the question, her fingers tightening around her gloves. "No," she said firmly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Lord Marston was always careful with his finances. He had investments, of course, but nothing that would suggest any risk. If there were debts, I was never made aware of them. Poirot nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "And yet, madam, a letter was found hidden away, a threat, suggesting that your husband may have owed something to someone. It seems that he was involved in dealings that you were unaware of." Lady Caroline's face paled further, but she held her ground. "I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. Lord Marston was a good man. He kept his affairs to himself, but I don't believe there were any secrets worth hiding." Poirot gave her a quiet, penetrating look, then turned to the rest of the room. "I believe there is more to this story than what we've been told, and I believe that someone here has the answers, someone who knows the truth about Lord Marston's dealings, someone who may have been involved with him, but whose relationship with him was not as it seemed." A murmur rippled through the guests as Poirot's words sank in. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to one another, suspicion thick in the air. Poirot continued, his voice calm but unwavering. "I will need to speak to each of you one by one about your interactions with Lord Marston. It is time to uncover the connections, the alliances, the secrets that have been kept hidden, and it is time for the truth to come to light." The guests exchanged glances, and though none of them spoke, Poirot could feel the growing unease. Each of them had a part to play in this intricate drama, and it was only a matter of time before the threads of their stories began to unravel. Poirot's eyes fell on Wainwright again, who seemed unusually quiet. He had been the first to mention the strange noise heard before the body was discovered, and though he had seemed eager to help earlier, there was a shift in his demeanor now. He was avoiding eye contact, his gaze darting to the floor. Poirot knew that Wainwright was hiding something, something important. "Wainwright," Poirot said, his tone sharp, "you mentioned earlier that you had seen someone, Dr. Thorne, near the scene. But tell me, monsieur, was there anyone else around at that time? Any other unusual figures who might have been involved?" Wainwright stiffened, but his expression remained neutral. "I saw nothing, monsieur," he replied quickly, but Poirot could see the subtle twitch of his jaw, the nervous clenching of his fists. "Are you sure, monsieur?" Poirot pressed, his voice quiet but insistent. You said you were alone, and yet you saw Dr. Thorne. You didn't mention anyone else. Is there something you have forgotten?" Wainwright's eyes flickered. His lips parted as though he were about to speak, but he quickly shut them again, swallowing hard. He shifted in his seat, discomfort radiating from him in waves. Poirot could feel the hesitation in him, the crack in his defenses. I didn't see anyone else." Wainwright stammered, but there was a catch in his voice, a slight tremor that betrayed his nervousness. "I swear." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his suspicions rising. There was something Wainwright was not saying, something important. "Very well, monsieur," Poirot said, his voice a little colder. "But remember, I will find the truth. You can only hide it for so long." He turned his attention back to the group, each person in the room now scrutinizing the others. The subtle connections were beginning to emerge, an unexpected alliance between Wainwright and Thorne, a possible hidden motive between Lady Caroline and her sister, the unsettling quiet of the household staff. Each new detail added another layer to the complexity of the case. The game was far from over, and Poirot knew that the next move was his. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. Poirot stood in the drawing room, his eyes scanning the faces of the guests. He had spent hours questioning them, piecing together their stories, and yet the mystery remained unsolved. The more he observed, the more he realized that the key to unlocking the truth lay not in what had been said, but in what had been left unsaid. A subtle tension hung in the air, and Poirot knew it was time to apply pressure. "Madam," Poirot began, turning his gaze to Lady Caroline, who had remained silent for the past few minutes, lost in thought. "You mentioned earlier that Lord Marston had business dealings you were unaware of. I must ask again, what do you know about them? Who else was involved?" Lady Caroline shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I don't know much," she replied, her voice steady, but betraying a hint of frustration. "Lord Marston kept his financial matters to himself. He handled everything, and I trusted him. I never asked questions." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "You are certain, madam? There are always things one does not want others to know, things one hides for a reason. Did your husband have enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm him?" Lady Caroline's gaze dropped to the floor. "I don't know. He was always so careful with his affairs, but lately, I could sense something was off. He was distant, anxious even, but he never said why." Poirot paused, watching her carefully. He could see that she was telling the truth, at least as far as she knew, but her response only deepened the mystery. "I see," he said quietly. "And these letters, the ones you said he hid, what can you tell me about them?" Lady Caroline looked up, her eyes wide with distress. "I don't know much. He never showed them to me, but I overheard him speaking to his solicitor a few weeks ago. He seemed upset, like someone was pressuring him." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Someone was pressuring him, you say? And yet, he kept this from you. There's a great deal more going on here, madam. But for now, we shall move on." Lady Caroline fell silent, her hands still clenched tightly in her lap. Poirot turned his attention to the others in the room. The air was thick with suspicion, but he knew that the pieces were beginning to fall into place. "Monsieur Wainwright," Poirot called, his gaze settling on the young man who had been standing quietly by the door. "You mentioned earlier that you saw Dr. Thorne near the scene, before Lady Caroline discovered the body. Tell me more about this. What exactly did you see?" Wainwright shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. I saw him," he said, his voice faltering. "He was leaving the aviary just as Lady Caroline entered. I didn't think much of it at the time. I didn't know what was going on. But when I heard about the murder, it struck me as odd." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind working quickly. "You didn't think much of it at the time, monsieur, but now you do. Why? What makes it odd?" Wainwright swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I don't know. It's It seemed like Dr. Thorne was in a hurry. He didn't want to be seen. Poirot observed him carefully. A man who does not want to be seen, this is telling. "Thank you, monsieur. I will return to this shortly." Wainwright nodded and stepped back, looking relieved to be out of the spotlight. Poirot's attention shifted to Marguerite, who had been silent for some time. She was seated near the window, her eyes cast downward. She had been the one to overhear the argument between Lord Marston and the mysterious man, and Poirot needed to know more. "Madame Marguerite," Poirot called, his tone calm yet insistent. "Earlier you mentioned overhearing a conversation between Lord Marston and another man. Could you tell me more about this? Did you hear anything specific?" Marguerite hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. I didn't hear much. Just that Lord Marston seemed upset. The man was angry, and Lord Marston was trying to calm him down. He said something about paying the price, but that's all I remember." Poirot nodded, his mind racing. "Paying the price, that is a very important detail, madam. And this man, do you remember anything about him? His appearance, his voice?" Marguerite shook her head, her eyes distant. "No, I didn't see him. I didn't want to get involved. It was private, I suppose." Poirot's eyes never left her face. "Madam, I must insist. The smallest detail could be the key. Was there anything about his voice? His manner?" Marguerite paused, then shook her head again. "I don't know. It was just a voice deep, but that's all I can say." Poirot stood in silence for a moment, his mind processing the new information. "Very well, madam," he said softly. "Thank you for your help. Please, stay alert. This is not over." Marguerite nodded, visibly relieved as she leaned back in her chair. Poirot turned toward the others, his mind already analyzing the new pieces of the puzzle. The argument, the mysterious man, the cryptic message about paying the price. Everything seemed to be pointing in the same direction. But Poirot knew that the final piece was still missing. There were still more connections to uncover, more relationships to explore. The truth was close, but it had not yet fully revealed itself. With a final glance at the guests, Poirot spoke again, his voice calm and sure. "We are getting closer. I will need to speak to Dr. Thorne once more, and soon we shall uncover everything." The game had shifted, and Poirot was ready to close in on the truth. Chapter 11. Tension's Risseth room was thick with unease as the guests exchanged nervous glances. Poirot had gathered them all once more, each of them on edge, knowing that the unraveling mystery of Lord Marston's death was inching closer to a conclusion. But the more he observed, the more he realized that this investigation was far more complex than he had initially thought. The web of deceit was tighter, the lies more elaborate. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of each suspect. He had gathered enough information to know that each of them had a part to play, but none of them seemed to know how to fully trust one another. The relationships between them were strained alliances that had once been strong were now fractured, and fear had replaced any semblance of camaraderie. "Madam," Poirot addressed Lady Caroline, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "You have said that Lord Marston had business dealings that you were unaware of, and yet you also mentioned that he seemed troubled in the days leading up to his death. Tell me, was there anyone in his life who might have had a reason to harm him? Any rival, perhaps, or someone who could have threatened him?" Lady Caroline's face was pale, her hands twisting the edge of her shawl. She had become more withdrawn since their last conversation, the weight of the mystery pressing down on her. "I don't know," she whispered. "I never asked about his business dealings. He didn't want me involved, and I respected that. But I know he was worried about something. He never said what it was, but I could tell. He was not himself." Poirot observed her, taking in her words carefully. "This is important, madam. You must think carefully. Who did your husband associate with, and who might have had a stake in his downfall. Lady Caroline shook her head, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know, she said quietly. I just want to understand. Why would someone do this to him? Poirot gave her a brief nod, his expression unreadable. Very well, madam. We will find the answers. But you must trust me, I am close. I am certain of it. He turned away from her, his eyes now shifting to Wainwright, who had been standing quietly near the window, his face tense. The young man had been avoiding direct eye contact since his last interview, and Poirot sensed that the pressure was starting to take its toll on him. Monsieur Wainwright. Poirot called, his voice firm. I must ask you once more about the man you saw near the aviary. You said you saw Dr. Thorne leaving the area before Lady Caroline found the body. But I wonder, monsieur, did you see anyone else? Any other figures who might have been around at that time? Wainwright's eyes darted to the floor, his discomfort palpable. He shifted on his feet, and Poirot could see the unease in his posture. No, Wainwright answered quickly, his voice faltering. I didn't see anyone else, just Dr. Thorne, but I told you about that already. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Monsieur, you say that you saw nothing else, but the way you avoid my gaze suggests that there is more you are not telling me. I ask you again, did you see anyone else? Anyone who might have been near Lord Marston's body? Wainwright swallowed hard, his throat tightening as he tried to keep his composure. He hesitated for a moment, his hands gripping the edge of the windowsill for support. I didn't see anyone else. I swear. Poirot stood still for a moment, considering his next move. Wainwright's nerves were starting to unravel, and Poirot knew that something was amiss. The young man's discomfort was a signal, a small but significant clue. He needed to press harder to make Wainwright feel cornered. Do you understand, monsieur, that by withholding information, you are complicating this investigation? Poirot asked softly, his voice carrying an edge of quiet authority. You may not realize it, but each of you is connected to this crime. Each of you has something to hide, and I will find it. Wainwright's face paled, his lips trembling. I don't know anything more, he stammered. I swear. Poirot said nothing more, but the tension in the room grew thicker. Wainwright had all but admitted that he was hiding something, but what? Poirot was beginning to form a picture in his mind, but he needed more. The pieces were scattered, but not yet in place, turning away from Wainwright. Poirot addressed the group. You are all tangled in this web of lies. I have spoken to each of you, and I know that you are withholding the truth. The time for secrets is over. The time for answers is here. He turned his attention to Marguerite, who had been sitting quietly throughout the exchange, her face unreadable. Madame Marguerite, Poirot began, I must ask you once more about the argument you overheard between Lord Marston and the mysterious man. You said that they were discussing something important, something about paying the price. Do you remember anything else? Was there any other detail that could help us understand this man's intentions? Marguerite shifted in her seat, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of her hair. I told you everything I know, she said, her voice shaking. It was just an argument. I didn't hear anything else. I don't know who the man was. Poirot studied her closely, noting the subtle shifts in her behavior. There was something she wasn't saying, something she was holding back. Madam, I know that you are hiding something. You heard more than you are willing to admit. Marguerite's face flushed with guilt. I don't know what you mean, she protested, but Poirot could see the cracks in her story enough. Poirot said, his voice growing more insistent, You are not fooling me. There's more to this, and I will find it. As he spoke, he could feel the walls closing in. The truth was getting closer, he could almost taste it. But first, he needed to unravel the threads of suspicion, the lies that each of them had woven around themselves. The game had reached its climax, and soon he would have the answers. The room was on edge, but Poirot remained calm. He knew that the final piece was within reach, and soon everything would be revealed. Chapter 12. The confrontation tension in the room was palpable, the air heavy with uncertainty. Poirot had pushed the guests to the edge, each of them on high alert, unable to avoid the looming question: who among them was responsible for the death of Lord Marston? His strategy was clear now. He had carefully examined each of their responses, each of their behaviors, and it was time to bring everything into the open. The truth, he knew, was buried beneath layers of deception, and it was only a matter of time before it came to light. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his posture immaculate, his expression calm yet unyielding. The guests were seated, their eyes fixed on him, their anxiety rising with each passing second. He could feel the weight of their suspicion, their fear, but he remained composed, knowing that the final pieces of the puzzle were within reach. "Monsieur Wainwright," Poirot began, his voice steady. "Earlier, you told me you saw Dr. Thorne near the aviary. You were quite certain of that, were you not?" Wainwright stiffened in his seat, his fingers twitching nervously. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot," he replied, his voice tight. "I was sure. I saw him. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, I wonder if it means something." Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Wainwright's face. "Indeed. And yet, monsieur, you also told me that you didn't hear anything unusual, that you saw no one else near the scene. But I wonder, why did you not mention this earlier? Why the hesitation?" Wainwright's eyes flickered with guilt, and Poirot saw the change in his expression. Something was breaking within him. The facade of innocence was cracking, and Poirot was determined to press on. He needed to push harder to reveal the truth, to make Wainwright's confession inevitable. I didn't think it was important," Wainwright stammered, his eyes darting to the other guests before returning to Poirot. "I didn't want to cause trouble. I was just confused. I thought it was nothing." Poirot's gaze hardened. "But Monsieur Wainwright, you must understand. In this case, nothing is insignificant. Every small detail, every word could be the key. And you are not the only one with something to hide." At Poirot's words, the room seemed to hold its breath. The guests shifted in their seats, some glancing nervously at one another, others too afraid to make eye contact. Poirot's words had struck a chord with them all. No one was without suspicion now. They had all been pulled into this intricate web, and the truth was within reach. Poirot turned to Dr. Thorne, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Monsieur Thorne," he said, his voice cool but firm, "you were near the scene, too. You were one of the last to speak with Lord Marston, and yet you failed to mention your presence when I first questioned you." Thorne stiffened, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He had been trying to maintain a calm facade, but now his discomfort was evident. "I told you I was only checking on the birds," he said quickly, his voice betraying his nervousness. "There was no reason to bring it up earlier. It was just a routine check." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "And yet, monsieur, you did not tell me about the strange noise the servants heard, the sound of something heavy falling. Why did you not mention that at the time?" Thorne shifted in his seat, his eyes darting briefly to the others before returning to Poirot. I didn't think it mattered," he stammered. "I didn't think anyone would be interested in such trivial details." "Trivial?" Poirot repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You call it trivial when a strange noise precedes the discovery of a murder. This is no small matter, Monsieur Thorne. You are hiding something, and I will find it." The room fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words settling over everyone. Thorne's eyes darted nervously, his lips pressed into a thin line. Poirot could see that the doctor was on the verge of a confession, but the fear in his eyes told Poirot that he was still holding back. Poirot stepped forward, his voice low but intense. "Monsieur Thorne, I will ask you again. What were you doing near the aviary? What did you see? What did you hear?" For a moment, It seemed as though Thorn might crumble under the pressure. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it again, his jaw tightening. The seconds stretched into an eternity, the tension unbearable. Finally, Thorn spoke, his voice shaky. I saw something I didn't want to believe. His voice cracked as he continued. Lord Marston he was involved with people he shouldn't have been. He owed money to dangerous individuals. I tried to warn him. I tried to get him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. Poirot's eyes widened slightly, the pieces beginning to fall into place. You knew then. You knew who he was involved with, and you failed to stop him? Thorn's expression was filled with regret. I didn't know how to help him. He was too proud, too stubborn. He had been receiving threats, but he didn't want anyone to know. I tried to tell him it was dangerous, but he just brushed it off. Poirot stepped back, his mind racing. So Lord Marston had been involved with dangerous people who were willing to kill for what they were owed. This was the break Poirot had been waiting for. But there was more to uncover. The connections were deep, and it was clear that many people in the room were tangled in this web of secrets. Poirot turned to the others, his eyes scanning their faces. We are not finished. There is much more to uncover, and the truth will come to light soon enough. As the room remained silent, Poirot's mind raced with the new information. He was closer than ever, but there was still one last piece to find, one final truth that would reveal everything, and he was determined to uncover it, no matter what it took. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The atmosphere in the drawing room had shifted again. The guests sat in tense silence, each of them fully aware that the investigation was coming to a head. Poirot's gaze swept over them, lingering on their faces as he silently evaluated each person. They were all trying to hide something, but Poirot had a way of making it impossible for them to keep their secrets for long. Dr. Thorne had been one of the most composed members of the group, but even he had begun to show signs of stress. He had been cornered by Poirot's questions, and it was clear now that he was struggling to maintain his calm facade. Poirot knew that the next step in this investigation was critical. He had pushed the guests to their limits, but now he needed to press further. The time for subtlety was over. Just as Poirot was about to speak again, a noise interrupted the tension in the room, a faint, frantic sound coming from the hallway. It was a noise that none of the guests had expected. A sudden, high-pitched cry echoed through the still air. It was brief, but enough to send a ripple of fear through the group. Lady Caroline's face drained of color, and she turned to look toward the door. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Poirot, ever alert, turned toward the source of the sound. His expression sharp. Without a word, he moved toward the door, his mind already racing with the possibilities. He knew that whatever had caused the cry was important. It was a shift in the investigation. A new clue. As Poirot stepped into the hallway, the others hesitated behind him. He reached the source of the noise, a servants' corridor, where the sound had come from. Inside one of the small rooms, a servant Emily was kneeling on the floor, her hands pressed to her face, sobbing uncontrollably. Poirot didn't hesitate. He stepped inside the room, his eyes scanning the scene. The young woman was clearly distraught, and the room felt heavy with the weight of her distress. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently but firmly, "what is it? Why are you in such distress?" Emily looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she whispered, her voice trembling. I found something." Poirot's gaze softened, but his mind remained focused. "What did you find, mademoiselle?" he asked. "Tell me, and I will help you." Emily's sobs were lessening, but her words were still shaky. "A letter," she said, wiping her eyes. "It was in the linen closet. I didn't open it, but I saw the envelope. It was addressed to Lord Marston, and it said from the unknown." Poirot's pulse quickened. "A letter," he repeated, his mind working at lightning speed. "Did you keep it?" Emily nodded, her hands still trembling. She quickly moved to a small desk in the corner of the room. Pulling open a drawer and retrieving the letter, she handed it to Poirot with unsteady hands. Poirot took the envelope carefully, his fingers brushing the paper as he examined it. It was plain, with no return address, no markings to suggest who it had come from. He opened it slowly, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The message was short, cryptic, and threatening. It mentioned Lord Marston's dealings with dangerous individuals and warned that he would pay the price for his actions. The tone was chilling, but Poirot's mind was already piecing together the puzzle. The letter was a direct threat, and it confirmed what he had suspected all along. The murder was not random. It was a carefully planned act, orchestrated by someone who had a vested interest in Lord Marston's downfall. Poirot turned to Emily, his voice firm but reassuring. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You have helped more than you know." Emily nodded, her face still pale but visibly relieved. Poirot looked down at the letter, his mind racing with the implications of this new discovery. The words were clear. Lord Marston had been targeted by someone he owed, someone willing to kill to settle the score. As Poirot returned to the drawing room, the weight of the situation settled heavily on him. The letter was a breakthrough, but it wasn't enough on its own. He needed to connect the dots. Who was the person behind the threat? And why had they chosen Lord Marston? The pieces were starting to come together, but Poirot knew that the answers were still hidden in the shadows, and he would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. With the letter safely tucked away in his pocket, Poirot turned back to the group. The investigation had taken a darker turn, but he was more determined than ever to see it through. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. Tension in the room had never been greater. Poirot stood at the center, his eyes scanning the faces of the guests. Each one of them seemed to hold their breath, knowing that the end was near yet. None of them could be sure how it would unfold. Poirot had pushed them all to the brink, uncovering more and more with each step. But the final piece, the one that would complete the puzzle, was still elusive. Poirot's gaze fell on Lady Caroline, who had remained unusually quiet. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat, and her eyes darted from one person to the next. The weight of the situation was clearly bearing down on her. "Madam," Poirot began, his voice calm but piercing, "we spoke earlier of your husband's business dealings. You mentioned that you knew nothing of them, yet you are aware of his distress. Is there anything else you've held back? Something you haven't told me?" Lady Caroline swallowed hard, her face pale. "I told you everything, Monsieur Poirot. He was secretive, but I never suspected this." She seemed to be searching for the right words. "But the truth was too painful. I know he owed money, business debts, I suppose, but I never imagined it would come to this." Poirot studied her carefully. "Did anyone threaten him? Did he mention someone specific?" Lady Caroline shook her head slowly. "No, nothing specific. But he was frightened, and he kept those letters hidden from me. I didn't know what to think." Poirot's eyes darkened. The letter, the same one Emily had discovered, from the unknown message. His instincts told him that the letters were central to the mystery, but they were not the only clue. "Thank you, madam," Poirot said softly. "You've been most helpful." Turning to Wainwright, Poirot shifted gears. "Monsieur Wainwright, you mentioned seeing Dr. Thorne near the Aviary just before Lord Marston was found dead. What exactly did you see?" Wainwright stiffened, his eyes darting nervously. "I saw him leaving the Aviary. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, with everything happening, it seems important." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Important, indeed. But what else do you know, monsieur? You mentioned that Dr. Thorne seemed anxious. What did you notice about his behavior?" Wainwright shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He was nervous, almost a calm, like he was trying to avoid being seen. Poirot's gaze lingered on Wainwright, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. So, Dr. Thorne was near the scene. What more do you know? I didn't see anything else, Wainwright answered quickly, though his discomfort was obvious. Poirot nodded slowly. Very well. I shall return to this later. With that, he turned to Marguerite. She had been sitting silently, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her dress. Madame Marguerite, the argument you overheard between Lord Marston and the mysterious man, did you hear anything more? Marguerite hesitated, her gaze avoiding Poirot's. No, monsieur. It was just an argument. Lord Marston seemed upset, but I couldn't make out much. Just that he was trying to calm the man down. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes intense. But you heard paying the price, did you not? That is important, madam. You must think. Marguerite looked up, a faint flush creeping onto her cheeks. I don't know. I didn't want to be involved. But yes, I heard him say that. Poirot paused, studying her reaction. And this man, did you hear his voice? His appearance? Marguerite shook her head. I didn't see him clearly. I couldn't make out much. Poirot's mind raced. A mysterious man, an argument, and the phrase paying the price. It was becoming clearer by the moment, but there was still one piece left. Dr. Thorne. The doctor had been hiding something, and Poirot had a feeling it would be the final clue to solving the case. As if on cue, Dr. Thorne shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding the eyes of the others. Poirot turned toward him. Monsieur Thorne, he said, his voice calm but unyielding, you have been evasive. You know more than you are letting on. It is time to tell me everything. Thorne's face drained of color as he looked up. I've told you everything, he said, his voice trembling. I didn't want this to happen. Poirot stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the doctor. You were near the scene, and you knew more about Lord Marston's dealings than you've admitted. You've been hiding something. Dr. Thorne's hands shook as he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth was now within reach, and Thorne knew it. Poirot's gaze sharpened. You cannot run from this, Monsieur Thorne. The truth will be revealed, and you will face it, whether you want to or not. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and Poirot knew that the final reveal was drawing near. Soon, everything would be exposed. Chapter 15. The final gathering. The drawing room was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Poirot had done what he could, questioning, observing, connecting the dots, but now the time had come to bring everything together. The guests were seated before him, their faces a mixture of anxiety, guilt, and fear. Each of them knew that the final moments of this investigation were upon them, and no one was sure who would be revealed as the murderer. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when everything would make sense. The pieces of the puzzle were in place, and now he had to reveal the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, Poirot began, his voice calm but unwavering. We have come to the final stage of this investigation. It is time to reveal the truth of what happened to Lord Marston. The room fell silent as Poirot's words sank in. The guests exchanged glances, each of them waiting for the detective to speak again, but none daring to break the tension that hung in the air. Each of you has been questioned, Poirot continued. Each of you has been examined for inconsistencies, for motives, for lies. And what I have uncovered is not what I expected. This is no simple case of a single act of violence. This is a story of manipulation, of secrets, and of guilt. Lady Caroline shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes fixed on Poirot. She was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot? Who did it? Who killed my husband? Poirot turned his gaze to her, his expression soft but firm. I will tell you who killed Lord Marston, madam. But first, let me remind you of what we know. He turned toward the others, his eyes scanning their faces. Lord Marston had debts, hidden dealings, and people from his past who wanted something from him. We know this now, thanks to his letters, thanks to the threats he received. But Lord Marston was not the only one with something to hide. He looked directly at Dr. Thorne, who had been unusually quiet throughout the proceedings. "Monsieur Thorne," Poirot said, his voice sharp, "you knew more than you admitted. You were involved in Lord Marston's affairs, and you were hiding something." Thorne's face went pale, but he didn't protest. Poirot pressed on. The threats Lord Marston received were not just about money, they were about power. But power does not always come from wealth. Sometimes it comes from knowing someone's weaknesses, from controlling the people around you. Poirot's gaze moved to Marguerite. "And Madame Marguerite," he said, his voice soft but firm, "you knew about your brother-in-law's dealings. You overheard the argument between him and the mysterious man, and you heard him say, 'Paying the price, this is not a small detail.' This was the key, the crucial piece that tied everything together." Marguerite's face flushed, and she avoided his gaze, her fingers trembling in her lap. Poirot continued, his eyes never leaving her. "The man your brother-in-law argued with was not just a stranger. He was a man from Lord Marston's past, someone he owed, someone who had a claim over him. But that is not the whole story. No, there was more at play here, secrets, hidden connections, and alliances that none of you have fully revealed." Poirot paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. "But who's the murderer, you ask? Who took Lord Marston's life?" He looked back at the group, his expression unreadable. "The answer is simple, but it requires you to see beyond the obvious." Poirot took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the faces of the guests before landing on Dr. Thorne. The doctor had been hiding something that was crucial to the investigation. It was time to confront him directly. "Monsieur Thorne," Poirot said, his voice low but resolute, "you did not just know of Lord Marston's debts, you were involved in them. You were in debt to the same people, and when Lord Marston failed to repay his part of the bargain, you feared the consequences. But you weren't the only one afraid. So were others." Thorne's face was drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth had caught up with him. Poirot continued, his voice growing colder. "You were desperate, Dr. Thorne. You knew the consequences of Lord Marston's actions, and you knew that he would never give in. You knew that the only way to end this was to silence him." The room fell into a stunned silence. Dr. Thorne's hands shook, and his lips parted as if to say something, but the words never came. Poirot stepped closer, his eyes locked onto Thorne's. "It was you, Monsieur Thorne, who killed Lord Marston. You were the one who struck the final blow, the one who ended his life to protect yourself and your own secrets." The truth had been revealed. The final piece had fallen into place, and as Poirot stood there, watching the shocked faces around him, he knew that justice would soon follow. "Now," Poirot said, his voice softening but still firm, "it is time to answer for your actions, and justice, as always, will be served." The room was silent as Poirot's words hung in the air, the weight of the revelation settling over them all. Chapter 16. The revealed silence in the room was suffocating. Every eye in the room was fixed on Dr. Thorne, who had been caught in the web of deceit and guilt. Poirot's words echoed in the air like a heavy, final verdict. Thorne stood frozen, his face a mask of fear and disbelief, as if he had just come to terms with the truth himself. His hands trembled at his sides, unable to grasp the enormity of what had just been exposed. Lady Caroline's breath hitched as she looked from Poirot to the doctor. "But, Dr. Thorne, you..." Her voice trailed off, her disbelief clear. "Why? Why would you kill him?" Poirot stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Thorne. "It was simple, madam," Poirot said calmly. "Lord Marston was a man who had many debts, but none more pressing than the one he owed to dangerous people. These were the people who had taken hold of his life, pulling the strings. demanding that he pay up or face the consequences. He turned to Dr. Thorne, his voice hardening. "And you, Monsieur Thorne, were tied to those debts as well. Lord Marston had failed to fulfill his part of the deal. You, too, were in debt, but you feared the consequences more than anyone. So, when your options ran out, you did what you thought was necessary: silence him. End it before your own life, your own secrets, were exposed." Thorne's lips quivered, but he remained silent. He could no longer deny it, nor could he escape it. His guilt was plain for all to see. He looked up at Poirot, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to, but I had no choice. I was trapped. I was involved in things I couldn't escape from. And when Lord Marston refused to help, I saw no other way out." Poirot nodded solemnly. "I understand, monsieur, but the truth is not so easily buried. Your desperation led to murder. You believed that by taking Lord Marston's life, you could silence the past. But as you've seen, the past does not remain silent for long. The room remains still." Poirot's gaze swept across the other guests, whose eyes were wide with shock. Lady Caroline, Marguerite, Wainwright, they were all struggling to process the revelation. But they had seen the truth now. They could no longer pretend it wasn't there. "Monsieur Thorne," Poirot continued, his voice softer now, "you thought you could escape the consequences of your actions. But the truth, as always, has a way of coming to light, and you cannot outrun it." Thorne's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging as the weight of his guilt seemed to crush him. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I never thought I'd be caught." Poirot's expression softened slightly, though his words remained firm. "And yet, here we are. It is the consequence of your actions, Monsieur Thorne." For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was thick with the weight of what had been revealed. The air felt heavier, the truth now out in the open, as undeniable as the silence that followed. Finally, Poirot turned toward the others. "I understand your shock," he said. "None of you could have known. But now you do. Lord Marston was murdered, not because of random chance, but because of the choices he made. And those choices, unfortunately, led him to a tragic end." Marguerite looked as though she were struggling to hold herself together. She turned to Lady Caroline, her voice shaking. I never knew. I never thought it could be someone so close." Lady Caroline, still in disbelief, could only stare at Dr. Thorne. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I trusted you. I never thought it would come to this." Poirot watched them carefully, his expression softening slightly. He knew this was not easy for them. The shock of betrayal, of having someone so close to them implicated in the death of a loved one, it was a truth no one was prepared for. "Justice will be served, of course," Poirot said, his voice steady. "But understand this, the truth cannot always be neatly packaged. Sometimes the truth is murky, complicated by human nature, by fear, by desperation, by the choices we make when we feel we have no other options." Double quotes. Dr. Thorne, still standing near the door, had not moved. He was resigned, his shoulders slumped, the fight drained from him. His hands hung limply at his sides, his eyes focused on the floor as if hoping to disappear. "Do you understand, Dr. Thorne?" Poirot asked, his voice gentle but commanding. "The consequences of your actions are not something you can escape. You must face them." The doctor nodded, his face crumpling in regret. I know. Poirot stepped back, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. The room was still. The mystery had been unraveled, the truth revealed. Now, all that was left was the final reckoning. "I will take care of the rest," Poirot said quietly. "But the truth is always more powerful than any lie, and in the end, it is the truth that prevails." As Poirot finished speaking, the room remained still, the truth now fully realized. The story of Lord Marston's death had been long in the making, but now It was finally over. The mystery had been solved. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice's weight of Poirot's words lingered in the room. Dr. Thorne stood motionless, his face pale as he processed the reality of what had been revealed. The truth was now undeniable. The confession had been made, but the emotional toll on everyone present was far from over. Lady Caroline sat stiffly in her chair, her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet anyone's eye. Evelyn's posture was rigid, her arms crossed tightly, as if bracing herself for some unknown blow. The others, Marguerite, Wainwright, and the housekeeper, remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts, struggling to come to terms with the revelations that had shattered their understanding of the man they had trusted. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his presence commanding yet calm. The investigation had been long and winding, filled with twists and turns that had only led them to this moment. But now, with the truth laid bare, Poirot knew that the end was near. Monsieur Thorne. Poirot began, his voice steady but full of authority. You have confessed to Lord Marston's murder, but we must not overlook the reasons behind your actions. You were trapped by your own choices, your own secrets. But now, justice must be served. Thorne's lips trembled, and he looked up at Poirot, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and fear. I never wanted any of this, he murmured. I thought I could get away with it. I thought that by taking Lord Marston's life, I could erase my mistakes. But now I see what I've done. Poirot nodded solemnly. Yes, monsieur, you see it now. But what of those who remain in the shadows? What of the lives you've affected, those whose worlds you've shattered? Can you undo what you've done? The room fell silent once again. The weight of Poirot's words settled over them all, and for a brief moment, Dr. Thorne seemed to shrink in on himself, the enormity of his actions too much to bear. Lady Caroline finally spoke, her voice wavering. How could you, Dr. Thorne? You were like family. We trusted you, and now I don't know what to think anymore. Thorne bowed his head, unable to look her in the eye. I didn't know what to do, he whispered. I was into deep. Lord Marston wouldn't listen. I thought if I killed him, I could stop the destruction. But instead, I've only made it worse. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Evelyn, her voice rising, interrupted. Sorry, that's all you can say? My father is dead, and now you say you're sorry? You took his life, and all you have is regret. Poirot raised a hand, silencing Evelyn, though his gaze softened. Mademoiselle, I understand your anger. It is natural to feel this way, but it is not for us to pass judgment in this moment. The law will decide what happens to Monsieur Thorne. But for now, we must allow him to confront his actions. The truth has been laid bare. Lady Caroline looked up slowly, her eyes wet with tears. And what now, Poirot? She asked softly. What happened to him? What happens to us? Poirot's gaze shifted to Lady Caroline, and his voice softened. Justice will be served, madam. Dr. Thorne will face the consequences of his actions. But you, too, must find a way forward. The truth, as painful as it is, will set you free. It may take time, but in the end, the past will not define you. Thorne stood silently, his shoulders hunched with the weight of his guilt. He had been part of a web of lies, a man desperate to escape his own demons. But in the end, his actions had caused more harm than he could have ever imagined. Poirot turned his attention to the others. You all have your part to play in this, whether you knew it or not. But now, we must focus on what comes next. He turned back to Thorne, his expression hardening. Monsieur Thorne, you will be taken into custody. You will face the law for your actions, and though there is no undoing what has been done, you must answer for your crime. Dr. Thorne nodded weakly, his hands trembling. I understand, he whispered. I will face whatever comes. Poirot turned toward the rest of the guests, his eyes scanning their faces. The truth is never easy to face. It exposes the darkness we try to keep hidden, the secrets we bury deep. But it is the only way forward, the only way to find peace. The guests were silent, each of them processing the weight of the truth in their own way. Poirot could see the impact of his words on them. Lady Caroline had lost her husband, but in the process, she had also lost her trust in the people around her. Evelyn's world had been turned upside down. The loss of her father now compounded by the betrayal of someone she had once trusted. The truth had been uncovered, but it had come at a high cost. Poirot knew that the final chapter of this case had been written, but the emotional aftermath would continue long after he left Greyfield Manor. With a final, lingering look at the room, Poirot turned toward the door. "The case is closed," he said, his voice steady. "But remember this, the truth always finds a way to the surface, no matter how deep it is buried." He left the room, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. The investigation had been solved, but for those left behind, the consequences of the truth would linger long after he was gone. Chapter 18. The closing remarked room had gone eerily quiet. The truth had been laid bare. Dr. Thorne, once a trusted family friend and physician, was revealed to be Lord Marston's murderer. The confession had been made, and now the atmosphere was thick with the consequences. Lady Caroline, Marguerite, and the rest of the household were still processing the revelation, their faces pale, their eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief, shock, and a deep, raw sense of betrayal. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his usual calm demeanor unwavering, though his mind was sharp as ever, piecing together the fragments of this complex puzzle. He had brought the truth into the light, but now the emotional toll was heavy on the family. The game had been won, but the cost was great. "Madam," Poirot began, turning to Lady Caroline, who was sitting near the window, her gaze unfocused. "You have learned the truth, but this does not change the pain it has caused. The man you trusted, your confidant, your husband's closest ally, has betrayed you. But you must remember this crime, as terrible as it is, does not define who you are." Lady Caroline met his gaze but said nothing, her eyes still clouded with tears. Her entire life had been built on trust, and now it had been shattered. Her husband's death had already left a wound that would take years to heal, and now, to find out that someone she had known for so long had taken part in it, someone she had trusted, confided in, was a blow she couldn't have prepared for. Poirot moved to the center of the room, where Dr. Thorne stood, still as a statue. His shoulders were slumped in defeat, his face pale, and his hands shaking. Though he had confessed, it was clear that the weight of his guilt had not fully settled on him. His head hung low, unable to meet anyone's eyes. There was no defiance left in him now, only the crushing reality of what he had done. "Dr. Thorne," Poirot continued, his voice steady, but filled with the gravity of the moment, "you have confessed to your crime, and the law will decide your fate. But I must ask you, what was it that drove you to such a desperate act?" Thorne's voice cracked when he spoke, and for a moment, it was clear that the confession had broken him. "I thought it was the only way. Lord Marston had crossed too many lines. I was involved in things I shouldn't have been, and when I saw the path he was heading down, I panicked. I thought if I could silence him, I could save myself." Poirot nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You thought you could escape your guilt by ending another man's life, monsieur. But what you failed to understand is that such actions only compound the darkness. You could not escape, and now you have brought more suffering upon yourself and those around you." Thorne nodded, his shoulders trembling as the weight of Poirot's words took full effect. "I was afraid of losing everything, my position, my future, and I thought I could make it all go away. But now it's too late." Poirot's eyes softened for a moment, but his voice remained firm. "Fear is a powerful motivator, monsieur, but in the end, It is not fear that holds the key to your redemption, it is your ability to face the truth, no matter how painful it may be. Turning his attention to Lady Caroline, Poirot continued, "Madam, you have learned a great deal today, not only about the man who betrayed you, but also about your own strength. This is a time of great loss, and though the truth hurts, it is the only thing that will allow you to move forward." Lady Caroline sat still, her gaze fixed on the floor. Her fingers gripped the edge of the chair, her knuckles white. She had lost everything: the man she had loved, the man she had trusted, and now, her sense of security. But Poirot was right. The truth, though painful, was the only thing that could free her from the weight of the lies. Marguerite, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "How do we move on from this? How do we continue?" Poirot turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "You move on, madam, by understanding that the past does not define you. What happened was tragic, but it is not the end. You have the power to rebuild, to find peace. But that can only happen once you confront the truth and embrace it." Evelyn, who had been standing by the door, now stepped forward, her eyes red from crying. "But what about him?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and sadness. "What happened to Dr. Thorne? What happens to us?" Poirot's gaze shifted back to Dr. Thorne, who remained unmoving. "He will face the law, mademoiselle. His actions will not go unpunished, but the consequences of his crime will be far-reaching, affecting everyone in this house." Evelyn looked at her mother, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. "How do we trust again? How do we move past this?" Lady Caroline, her voice steady but filled with sorrow, finally spoke. "I don't know, but we must try. For ourselves and for what's left of this family. We can't let the past destroy us." Poirot took a final glance at the room, his mind already moving forward to the next step in the investigation. The truth has been revealed, and now justice will take its course. But you, madam, mademoiselle, and the others here must now find a way to rebuild. The road ahead may be difficult, but it is not without hope. He turned toward the door, his footsteps firm and purposeful. "The case is closed, but remember, justice is not just about punishment. It is about understanding, about reconciliation, and only then can healing begin." With that, Poirot exited the room, leaving the guests to face the difficult road ahead. The case was solved, but the emotional aftermath would take time to unfold. For now, all that remained was the truth, and the fragile hope that, in time, it would lead them to a place of peace.